Danny Cevallos, the NBC News legal analyst, is in the on-deck circle because I read about a fascinating case out of Ohio within the last 24 hours. Actually, yesterday we were talking about ivermectin in a COVID context, and then post-show I read about a very interesting legal case in Ohio that raises a whole host of issues, and I thought this is perfect, right in Danny's wheelhouse. Let me get him back on the program. I'm relying on the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Ohio Capital Journal for the background, which says the following. A suburban Cincinnati woman whose husband has been on a ventilator at Westchester Hospital with COVID-19 won a court order forcing the hospital to treat her husband's novel coronavirus infection with an antiparasitic treatment commonly used for livestock. The case is one of a handful nationwide where courts have sided with family members and have forced doctors to use ivermectin. Judge Gregory Howard gave the go-ahead August 23rd to Dr. Fred Wagschel's prescription of 30 milligrams of ivermectin daily for 3 weeks, as requested by the wife. That would be Julie. Jeffrey Smith was in a medically induced coma on August 20, according to an affidavit that his wife filed with her lawsuit. She said, quote, "My husband is on death's doorstep. He has no other options," she wrote, adding that at another point that her husband's chances of survival had dropped to less than 30%. She said her husband is a network engineer for Verizon. He enjoys fishing, hiking, and camping with the family. The Smiths live in Fairfield Township. They've got 3 children. The lawsuit doesn't mention whether Jeffrey Smith is vaccinated against COVID-19, but of course, we all know that overwhelming majorities of people currently hospitalized are unvaccinated. As a matter of fact, data from the Ohio Department of Health shows of roughly 21,000 Ohioans hospitalized with COVID-19 since January 1, only about 500 were vaccinated. So what should happen in a case like this? Danny Cevallos, as I mentioned, is an NBC legal analyst. Danny, great to have you back. Great to see you. I hope that all is well with you.
Hello, and Tiki Taimane, Michael. Thank you so much for having me back.
You don't think I displaced you with my appearance in the summer school version of the wrap-up show, because that was not my intent, by the way.
Michael, it may not have been your intent, but let's face it, your broadcasting skill, your appearance on that show put my job in huge jeopardy for the wrap-up show because it was awesome. It was fantastic. And if you folks haven't heard it, get on your SiriusXM app and check it out. I hope it's still up, the summer school. It is a fantastic story of Michael's rise in radio and its relationship to the Stern Show. It really is worth a listen.
Widely rated as a 9. That's all I can say. Okay. It was a 9.
Definitely.
So, the Ohio case, much more serious matters. The case of Mr. Jeffrey Smith, the 51-year-old who came down with COVID-19 in early July and has been in intensive care for quite some time. There are a lot of issues here, right? I mean, there's the perspective of the patient. There's the reaction of the wife. There's the doctor. There's the hospital. How do you want to approach this as if we were in law school?
The way I'm glad you set it up that way, because for me, this was a case of the headline maybe not telling the whole story. And the headlines that I saw were essentially judge orders ivermectin. And while that's technically true, it doesn't really tell the whole story in that this is more a case, at least according to the complaint, which I read. And the complaint was filed by the wife of the husband seeking this ivermectin treatment, which I guess let's just put it in the category of experimental, just for shorthand today. And so this was a situation where she alleged that the hospital had given up any further treatments for her husband. She even kind of alleges a form of malpractice. And in the course of making this request, she said, I also got a prescription from a doctor. Now, we can make whatever value judgments about the doctor, but she has a script for the ivermectin. So this reminded me, I don't know if it did you, but for me, this took me back almost 20 years to kind of a Terry Schiavo situation, where the issue is, to what degree can families force certain treatments against the will of, say, the hospital? Or another common example, this reminded me of the situation with Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, where the hospital wants to give a transfusion of blood, but Jehovah's Witnesses, their spouses, may refuse it for another spouse. So if you step away from and maybe you can't step away, but step away from the controversial use of ivermectin, you have a spouse with a prescription. Is the doctor of dubious background? I don't know. But ultimately, it seems the judge, in a very short order, ordered that the ivermectin treatment could go forward. But I have to believe that the judge wouldn't have done that if there wasn't a script and there wasn't a spouse who is legally the person who gets to make those decisions in most cases, asking for that treatment.
So I'm so glad that you framed it that way. I think we all know by now that both the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC, they've warned Americans against the use of ivermectin to treat COVID-19. And to a casual, and part of this is because of whisper down the lane and the headlines get more and more sloppy, to a casual reader, they might take away that there's a judge in Ohio who said, no, give this patient the ivermectin, but it's more complicated than that. It's not as if the court is embracing or endorsing this guy. I hope I'm wrong, but he seems like he's on his last legs.
That's right.
And therefore, your Shivo reference, like, who are we to tell this family what they should be able to do in that circumstance?
Right. And in fact, the irony here is that this is perceived as the government through a judge, an individual judge, making healthcare decisions, when in a way it's really the opposite. It is a judge enforcing the individuals, and in this case, the spouse of the individual, making those healthcare decisions. In other words, a judge is upholding a family's choice over the government's choice and over the hospital's choice, which historically really can go either way. Depending on what side of the debate you come down and depending on the specific healthcare situation, reasonable minds will always differ on this topic, depending on the illness and depending on the treatment.
Danny, what if you were counsel to the hospital and they called your law firm and they said, Mr. Cevallos, here's the situation that we're faced with. And, you know, the CDC and the FDA, they're telling us this is not something that should be pursued as a treatment, but we find ourselves in this position where the family has a physician, he's written a script. What should we do?
Yeah, I think the hospital's chief concern is always going to be liability, because in a way, the hospital has the least dog in the fight, in that I think their duty is to go forward and say, here's all the relevant science. All the relevant science says this is what our standard of care is. And I don't mean to be jaded, but the hospital's chief concern isn't necessarily this particular individual, but adhering to the standard of care, because that will govern their liability as a corporation or even as an arm of the state. So their concern is, are we complying with the standard of care? What do we believe the standard of care is? And to the court, they should probably present, or probably did present, every piece of evidence of the CDC and all this overwhelming evidence of the fact that, in their opinion, this ivermectin is either too risky to be efficacious or to be good, or is just flat out bad. I mean, either way makes their point for them. And if the plaintiff's burden here, the wife, was to show essentially, I'm the wife, the legal duty automatically defaults to me if my husband can't make those decisions unless we made some prior arrangements. And this is the decision I make, and it's backed up by at least a prescription. And of course, I don't think it would be out of line for the court or the hospital to say, please take a look at from whence this prescription came to see if it's legitimate. I think that's a worthwhile investigation. But if it is an MD and it is a valid script, then I think that makes the burden for the hospital a lot harder.
Can a family, I'm asking this question in the abstract, can a family demand to be treated beyond the standard of care? I say I'm asking it in the abstract because I don't want to hang you up on literally whether prescribing ivermectin is outside the standard of care. So in a generic sense, can I, as a patient, on behalf of myself or a family member, demand that they give me something that is not within the standard of care?
I love that question because there are two questions within it. One is, can patients demand more than what a hospital is willing to give? In other words, should every single avenue be explored to preserve life, right? Sometimes it may not be economically viable. You know, healthcare is a study of limited resources for unlimited wants. Everybody wants to live as long as possible, as well as they can. And there is a limit. We can't use hospital resources to do absolutely everything the patient wants every time. Or is this a case of a patient wanting something that is contraindicated, that is against what the standard of care dictates? In other words, can you ask, I mean, here's a simple answer. Euthanasia is illegal. It's something that goes against all concepts of health, is the end of life. But sometimes that's what patients want. So that is, you know, I don't want to make that a clear analogy because it's not. There's so many differences. But I mean, in a sense, that's a patient asking for something that is against the standard of care. So context is everything. And with many COVID-19 issues, these are all issues of first impression. I mean, probably not since the Spanish flu 100 years ago have we had something like this. And our common sensibilities were totally different back then. Our ideas about healthcare were totally different back then. So in a situation like this, I think there's certainly precedent for patients asking for more than the hospital is willing to give, and there's precedent for patients asking for something that the hospital thinks is bad for them. I guess euthanasia is an overly simple example of that. I'm sure we could think of others. So I don't think this kind of ask is without precedent, but because every medical situation is different and every medical condition has different treatments. And now we're at a new frontier of a new treatment for some new menace, which is COVID-19. I think we've been here before, but we certainly haven't been here before with COVID-19 and ivermectin.
Danny, what about from the perspective of the physician who is prescribing something against the directive of the CDC or the FDA?
I mean, tread carefully, I guess, for those doctors. I mean, I think that's a difficult ethical choice for doctors to make, to go against the great weight. I mean, I guess we can say that CDC recommendations would be the great weight of evidence. Do they absolutely set the standard of care? I think some people would say yes. But I mean, as long as a judge makes the determination that this is not a script that goes completely against the standard of care, or, for example, is illegal, I don't care what MD you are. I don't know that you could prescribe cocaine. I mean, in different forms. But to give an example, I don't know that you could prescribe cyanide. But some doctors have, and some doctors do, or at least some doctors, like Dr. Kevorkian was a doctor who obviously, I believe, lost his doctorhood. So this kind of thing happens. I would say if I were a doctor, I would, be concerned with my professional viability, and I would probably lean towards advising doctors to preserve that at all costs, even if it means giving a patient or declining a patient's wishes and not giving them exactly what they want.
A non-legal observation from yours truly. I'm struggling to understand the mindset that says I'm not going to get vaccinated, but I am going to be entrusting my fate to something that is used to treat head lice, or something that's used as an anti-worming for dogs. I mean, I don't get it. Maybe in a case like this, you're on your last legs. I mean, God forbid if I found myself in the ICU on a ventilator and I was, in the 11th hour, I guess I would try absolutely anything. But along the way, people who have not yet gotten to that stage, I don't know why they're rejecting of one and not the other. I don't know if you'll have a thought on that or not.
I have a lot of thoughts on that. And I don't know that ever in our history, maybe you can think of an example, when Americans got sick, they would seek the medical advice that might help them. And sometimes you hear of in cases like cancer, first, after trying all the other things, people go to alternative medicine, right? You go to all kinds of different, acupuncture, things that are not traditional Western medicine, maybe Eastern medicine. But I don't know that ever in our history we've had a situation like you just described, where somebody gets sick and they say, darn the medical community, I'm going to figure this out on my own, or I'm going to take to the internet. Maybe it's the fact that whatever kind of information or backup that you want for your ideas is available, not just on the internet, but through some quasi-news source. And I think that's something that even you talked about on your recent summer school appearance. Was one of the big problems is the expansion of media to give, it creates an environment where no matter what idea you have that's out there, somewhere someone is broadcasting under the auspices of some legitimate form of news and backing those ideas up.
Sum up. Danny Cevallos, NBC legal analyst. What are we saying about the case of Jeffrey Smith in Ohio?
Don't blame the judge necessarily. I think you look at this case as a classic healthcare case. I teach healthcare law at Drexel University. This would be a perfect case for me to include in next semester, because it really is not so much about a judge imposing the government's will. It's quite the opposite. It's about the extent of the family and the next of kin and the spouse to make healthcare decisions within that family, with the advice of doctors that they choose, and the right of the hospital and the state to intervene.
Absolutely. Not the case that I thought I was about to read about when I first saw some of the headlines. Danny Cevallos, that was excellent. Thank you so much for coming back to the program. Bye for now.
I've said it all. Perhaps I've said too much, Michael.
We're humored by each other, if nothing else, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and the listeners out there that cross listen to both shows, of course.
Thank you, Danny. Appreciate it very much.